The morning air in the city was crisp, but inside the tall glass building, the atmosphere was anything but calm. The sun glinted off the skyscrapers, reflecting on the polished floor of the corporate office. But the real shine that morning came from the tension building inside the boardroom. The room was large, filled with leather chairs, glossy tables, and walls lined with framed awards and photographs of past successes. But despite all the symbols of wealth and power, the energy in the room was electric and tense. At the head of the table sat the billionaire, known for making billion-dollar deals in his sleep. His sharp eyes scanned the documents in front of him, moving from clause to clause with precision. His fingers tapped lightly on the table as he considered every line, every number, as if weighing the consequences of every word. Around him, executives and assistants sat silently, all waiting for his approval, some biting their nails, others tapping on laptops, all hoping to catch his attention at the right moment. The deal on the table was massive, something that could change the course of the company and cement the billionaire's reputation even further. This was not just any contract. It involved millions of dollars, partnerships across borders, and decisions that would affect thousands of employees. The stakes were enormous, and everyone in the room felt it. Some whispered quietly to each other, while others kept their eyes fixed on the CEO, afraid to make even a small sound. In the corner of the room, almost invisible, a young maid moved quietly, carrying a tray of tea and coffee. Her uniform was neat, and she walked with care, not wanting to disturb the powerful meeting. She had been cleaning offices in this building for months, but she had never been this close to such a high-level meeting before. Her heart raced a little as she set down the drinks, careful not to spill anything. She watched the CEO from the edge of her vision, noticing how every tiny detail seemed to matter to him. She had no formal training in business, no experience in contracts or negotiations, but something about the papers on the table caught her eye. She noticed small details that even the seasoned executives seemed to overlook: a tiny inconsistency, a number that didn't match, a word that could be interpreted in the wrong way. It was subtle, something only someone paying close attention could notice, and she realized that if no one caught it, the consequences could be disastrous. Meanwhile, the billionaire continued to speak, his voice calm but firm, outlining his expectations, his goals, the potential profits, and the risks involved. His presence was commanding, filling the room with an energy that made everyone else feel small and careful. He leaned forward, adjusting his cufflinks, scanning each person around the table, and giving them a look that silently said, "This is serious. Don't make a mistake here." Everyone else nodded, taking notes, flipping pages, checking numbers, all of them trained to catch mistakes, but the pressure of the moment made it easy to miss even the smallest detail. The maid, sensing the tension, paused in her work, her eyes flicking back to the papers on the table. She felt a strange mix of fear and determination, afraid to speak up, yet knowing she could not stay silent if something dangerous was about to happen. Her instincts told her that the billionaire, brilliant as he was, could overlook this, and the consequences could be irreversible. She adjusted her grip on the tray, took a quiet breath, and prepared herself for what she might do. Outside the room, the city carried on with its usual rush, unaware of the quiet storm inside the skyscraper. But inside, every second mattered, every glance, every word, every gesture could tip the scales. The CEO's hand hovered over the pen ready to sign, and the executives held their collective breath, anticipating the moment that could make history for the company. No one noticed the maid standing quietly at the edge of the room, yet she was about to play a part in the story that no one could have predicted. It was in that moment, amid the high-stakes tension, the polished floors, the whispered calculations, and the ticking clock, that the ordinary and the extraordinary were about to collide. The room was a world of power and influence, but in the quiet corner, the maid's presence reminded everyone that sometimes the smallest voices could hold the greatest importance. This version is simple, descriptive, and suspenseful, keeping the reader engaged while setting up the high-stakes atmosphere perfectly. If you want, I can continue with part 2, the maid's observation in the same style, around 800 words, so we can build the full 8-part story for your voiceover. Do you want me to do that next? As the meeting continued, the executives scribbled notes and whispered numbers to each other, but the maid's eyes were fixed on the contract, her curiosity slowly turning into concern. She had learned over the months to pay attention, not just to cleaning, but to how the office moved, how people acted under pressure, and now, standing quietly in the corner, she noticed something that no one else seemed to see. It was a tiny detail, almost invisible to a distracted eye, a clause buried deep in the fine print, a phrase that could easily be misinterpreted, a number that didn't add up, something so small that even the most experienced lawyers might overlook it if they were too focused on the bigger picture. She tilted her head, studying the papers, tracing the lines with her finger just to be sure. Her heart began to beat faster, because she realized that if this went unnoticed, the billionaire could lose millions, perhaps even ruin the deal. She took a careful step closer, careful not to draw attention. Her mind raced. Who am I to say something? I'm just a maid, she thought, yet her instinct was louder than her fear, and her eyes kept returning to the flawed line. The logic was simple, and her common sense told her that ignoring it could be catastrophic. She knew that even the tiniest oversight could snowball into disaster. Meanwhile, the billionaire leaned back in his chair, exuding confidence, completely absorbed in the discussion. His sharp eyes occasionally flicked toward the papers, but he was relying on his team to catch minor mistakes. He trusted the experts, the lawyers, the assistants, but he did not notice the maid's quiet presence, the one person who was observing with fresh eyes, unburdened by assumptions or hierarchies. The maid's hands trembled slightly as she held a clean cloth, pretending to dust the edge of the table, but her mind was entirely focused on the contract. She whispered softly to herself, "This can't be right. Something's wrong here." She repeated the words in her head, trying to make sense of it, trying to put it into a sentence she could say aloud if the moment came. She had always believed in speaking up when something was clearly wrong, even if it scared her. It was a lesson from her childhood. Her mother had told her, "If you see danger, don't wait for someone else to fix it. Say what needs to be said." Now, years later, that lesson echoed in her mind, giving her courage. She realized that courage didn't come from titles or status. It came from knowing the truth and being willing to act. Her gaze shifted around the room, noting the tension on the executives' faces, their focus entirely on numbers and negotiations. They were blind to the tiny error hidden in the mountain of words. Only she had noticed it, and the weight of that responsibility settled heavily on her shoulders. She could feel the magnitude of the moment, how one small observation could alter the course of a billion-dollar deal. Then, as if the universe gave her a quiet nod, the CEO leaned forward, his pen hovering above the signature line, ready to finalize everything. The maid froze, understanding that the time to act was near. Her mind raced, and she rehearsed the words. The sentence that could stop the contract and prevent a disaster. It needed to be short, clear, and firm, something that could grab attention without disrespect, something that could make the billionaire pause. For a moment, she imagined the consequences of speaking up, the embarrassment, the doubt, even dismissal, but those thoughts were fleeting, replaced by the certainty that ignoring the mistake would be far worse. Her heartbeat quickened, yet a strange calm settled over her, as if every step of her life had led to this instant. She was not just a maid in that room. She was a guardian of truth, even if only for a fleeting moment. As the meeting continued and the room buzzed with business chatter, the maid's eyes never left the contract, never left the flaw she had discovered. She knew that what she had to do was simple yet terrifying. Speak up, intervene, and hope that the billionaire would listen. All the power, all the wealth in the room, was irrelevant in the face of one small sentence that could change everything. And in that quiet observation, amidst the tension and wealth, the ordinary maid became more than she had ever imagined she could be, poised to transform the room with the insight that had come from paying attention, noticing details, and trusting herself. The billionaire sat at the head of the long, polished table, his posture straight, his expression calm but sharp. He exuded a kind of quiet authority that made the room feel smaller, as if all the tension and energy were drawn toward him. Every executive and assistant around the table knew that this was his domain, a place where mistakes could be unforgivable, and every word, gesture, and decision carried weight. He flipped through the pages of the contract with precise movements, eyes scanning every line, every number, every word mattered to him, but he also relied on the expertise of those around him. The room was silent except for the soft rustle of papers and the occasional tap of a keyboard. He didn't speak much at first, choosing to observe, to let the others present their points before making any comments. The billionaire's mind was a steel trap, calculating risks, predicting outcomes, imagining scenarios in which the deal could succeed or fail. He leaned back slightly in his chair, the sunlight from the windows glinting off his cufflinks, and spoke in a calm, even tone, outlining the vision for the deal, the potential growth, the advantages it could bring to the company. His words were measured, deliberate, each sentence designed to assert control, to display intelligence and confidence. Executives nodded, flipping through their own copies of the contract, repeating numbers and percentages under their breath. Each of them was trained to anticipate his questions, to prepare answers before he even asked. They had seen him in action many times before, and they knew that any hesitation or misstep could be costly. But even as they focused on their roles, they missed the small detail that the maid had noticed. The tiny flaw hidden in the sea of words. The billionaire paused, adjusting his chair, and looked around the room, his gaze sharp and precise. Everyone felt it, that weight of scrutiny, as if he could read their minds. His eyes flicked from one executive to another, silently judging, analyzing, weighing their competence. He spoke briefly, asking for clarifications, pointing out figures, and challenging assumptions. His presence was magnetic, drawing every ounce of attention toward him, making it impossible to focus on anything else. Yet, amid all the calculation and discussion, the maid in the corner remained focused, her eyes never leaving the line that could unravel everything. She noticed how the billionaire trusted the process, the people, the experience, but perhaps not the unexpected, the voice from the shadows. She realized that sometimes, brilliance can blind even the smartest, and that's where she could make a difference. He continued to review the document, occasionally murmuring comments under his breath. The executives leaned forward, anxious to impress, eager to answer correctly, eager to prove their worth. But the billionaire's mind was moving faster than theirs, connecting dots, weighing the implications of each clause, assessing the consequences if the deal went wrong. He was focused, relentless, almost untouchable in his concentration. Yet that focus left one small window open, a chance for someone, unnoticed, to intervene. The room felt suspended in time, as if holding its breath. The billionaire's focus was so absolute that nothing else seemed to exist. No noise, no movement, no warning from the world outside. All the power in the room, all the money and influence, seemed to orbit around his decisions. And yet, paradoxically, it was his concentration that made the moment so fragile. It was precise, intense, and yet vulnerable to a single spark of truth from an unexpected source. And that spark was the maid, watching silently, gathering courage, ready to bridge the gap between the power of observation and the reality of the mistake. She knew that this moment required careful timing, that she could not rush, yet could not delay. Her mind raced, heart pounding, as she imagined the potential consequences of speaking and of staying silent. She understood that the billionaire's brilliance was unquestionable, but even brilliance could be challenged by the simplest truth. As the executives prepared to finalize numbers, as the pen hovered over the signature line, the room filled with quiet anticipation, all eyes unknowingly waiting for a disruption. The billionaire remained unaware of the quiet observer at the edge of his kingdom. Yet in that very focus, that absolute immersion in work, he had created a space for the unexpected, for the overlooked, for the single sentence that could stop him cold. The room had grown even quieter, as if the very air was holding its breath. The executives leaned slightly forward, pens poised, laptops ready, all eyes on the billionaire, waiting for the moment he would sign the deal. But in the corner, the maid's heartbeat thundered in her chest, loud enough, it seemed, to match the ticking of an invisible clock. She had studied the contract, traced the numbers with her finger, and finally understood the gravity of what she had discovered. Her hands tightened around the tray she carried, though the cups did not rattle, and she took a careful, almost imperceptible step closer, her mind racing. She whispered to herself, barely audible, "I have to say it, now or never." Each second stretched longer than the last, the tension in the room thick, heavy, pressing down on everyone as though it could crush the smallest misstep. The billionaire's eyes were fixed on the papers, scanning, analyzing, unaware of the silent observer who had noticed the flaw no one else could see. She swallowed hard, feeling fear claw at her throat, but she pushed it down, replacing it with determination. The lesson from her childhood rang in her mind. Speak the truth, even if no one expects it. She took a deep breath, steadying her voice, rehearsing the sentence she had repeated silently dozens of times. "This clause, it doesn't match the agreement terms," she said, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the tense silence like a shard of glass. For a moment, the room seemed to freeze, as if time itself had paused. The billionaire's pen hovered above the signature line, mid-air, his eyes lifting to meet hers, and in that instant, the silence became unbearable, every executive holding their breath, unsure if they should move or speak. The maid stood frozen in place, small and unassuming, yet her words carried weight far beyond her position. The billionaire's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing his features. He was not used to being interrupted in moments like this, especially not by someone so low in the hierarchy. The room waited, the tension almost unbearable, and the executives glanced nervously at one another, unsure if the mistake had been spotted by anyone else, unsure of whether to intervene or stay silent. The simplicity of her observation, the honesty in her tone, cut through the complex web of numbers and contracts. It was so obvious now, once spoken, that it was hard to believe no one else had noticed it. The clause she pointed out could have cost millions, if not more, and her courage had brought it to light just in time. The billionaire, still frozen, slowly lowered his pen, leaning back slightly, processing what he had just heard. In that moment, the power dynamics of the room shifted subtly but undeniably. The executives realized that brilliance and authority could be challenged by insight, regardless of rank. The maid, who had been overlooked all these months, suddenly became the center of attention. Though she did not move, did not boast, simply waited, letting her words sink in, letting the truth speak for itself. The billionaire's face was unreadable at first, a mix of surprise, calculation, and respect. He leaned forward again, scanning the contract carefully, checking the line she had pointed out, verifying the implications, and finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he exhaled slowly, a small smile forming at the corner of his lips. His eyes met hers briefly, an unspoken acknowledgement passing between them, a recognition that even the smallest voice could alter the course of great power. The executives shifted in their seats, some leaning back in relief, others nodding quietly, realizing that the maid's intervention had prevented a disaster. The tension in the room eased just slightly, but the lesson remained clear. No one, not even the billionaire, was beyond observation, beyond correction, beyond the simple truth spoken by someone brave enough to act. The maid remained calm, though inside, her heart still raced. She had stepped forward at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right words, changing the course of the day, the deal, and perhaps even the company's future. All around her, the room had acknowledged, silently but undeniably, that courage, clarity, and honesty could come from the most unexpected places, and that one voice, even the quietest, could freeze a billionaire mid-deal. For a moment, the room seemed to stop breathing, as if the very walls were holding back the air. The executives froze mid-motion, pens hovering above paper, eyes wide, hearts thudding in their chests. The billionaire himself remained motionless, his hand suspended over the contract, the words of the maid echoing in his mind. That single, simple sentence had landed like a thunderclap, shattering the rhythm of the room and halting the deal in its tracks. The silence was thick, almost tangible, pressing down on everyone like a heavy weight. No one dared speak, no one dared move, as if even the smallest sound could break the fragile balance. The executives exchanged nervous glances, some mouths opening slightly as if to say something, but the words caught in their throats, chilled by the sudden pause. They realized that the tiniest oversight could have caused catastrophic consequences, and it had taken someone unexpected to prevent it. The billionaire's eyes were locked on the maid, piercing and intense, trying to measure her, trying to understand how someone so ordinary could have noticed something that no trained executive had. There was disbelief there, a flash of incredulity that quickly shifted into recognition. He leaned back slightly, running a hand through his hair, as if to process what had just happened. His mind, usually racing with calculations and strategies, had been momentarily stopped in its tracks, caught off guard by a voice from the most unlikely corner. The maid stood quietly, composed yet trembling on the inside, aware of the eyes now all on her. She felt a mixture of fear, pride, and relief, knowing that the words she had chosen were clear enough to be understood but gentle enough not to insult or embarrass. She had walked a careful line, and now the results of her courage were unfolding in front of her. The executives shifted uneasily in their seats, suddenly realizing that all their training, all their experience, had not prepared them for this moment of revelation. Slowly, the billionaire exhaled, a deep, measured breath that seemed to release the tension that had built up in the room. He studied the contract again, checking the line she had highlighted, verifying the mistake, and then looked around at the others, who now waited with bated breath for his reaction. There was a silence so heavy it almost became a presence in the room, an unspoken acknowledgement that something extraordinary had just occurred. It was a moment of pure, suspended anticipation, as if the universe had paused to honor the smallest act of courage. The executives realized that the deal they had thought would conclude smoothly was now entirely in a different frame. The ordinary maid had disrupted the flow, forced a pause, and shifted the power of the moment without even raising her voice. Her observation had created a ripple effect that touched everyone in the room, reminding them that authority and expertise could be challenged by insight and courage. Then, a subtle change came over the billionaire, a flicker of a smile at the corner of his mouth, a recognition of brilliance where he had not expected it. He nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if to say, "You have done well." His eyes softened for a brief instant, and the room, sensing the shift, began to breathe again, cautiously, reverently, as though exhaling a long-held secret. The executives relaxed just a fraction, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others exchanging whispers that praised the maid's quick thinking. Even the most confident among them had to acknowledge that she had done what none of them could, had seen what none of them had noticed, and had spoken when it mattered most. The weight of her words, the courage behind them, had frozen the billionaire mid-deal and prevented a disaster that could have been catastrophic. The silence slowly transformed from shock to awe, a quiet reverence settling over the room. The maid, once invisible and overlooked, had commanded the attention of the most powerful people in the company without arrogance or entitlement. She had shown that true insight does not depend on status, and that sometimes, the smallest voice can carry the heaviest truth. In that suspended, hushed moment, everyone realized that they had witnessed something rare and remarkable, a moment where courage and observation had reshaped the course of a billion-dollar deal. The room remained quiet for a few more seconds, as if everyone was still digesting what had just happened. The billionaire sat back in his chair, eyes scanning the contract one more time, verifying the point the maid had made, and slowly, a sense of relief began to spread across the room. The executives, who had been frozen in disbelief, finally began to exhale, realizing that a disaster had been narrowly avoided. It was remarkable, almost unbelievable, that a maid, someone with no formal training in business or law, had spotted an error that all these highly paid experts had missed. The realization hung in the air like a tangible force, making the tension in the room shift from fear to awe. Each executive glanced around, silently acknowledging her courage and her intelligence, the kind of insight that could not be taught in any corporate seminar. The billionaire, usually so reserved and unapproachable, finally spoke, his voice calm but firm, commanding attention. This was an important observation, he said, his gaze lingering on the maid, a mixture of surprise, admiration, and respect flickering across his face. The words carried weight, and everyone in the room understood that this was not a simple compliment, but a recognition of someone who had altered the course of a high-stakes decision. The executives quickly began to verify her claim, cross-checking numbers, reviewing clauses, and confirming that she had been correct. Each moment of verification only cemented her role in preventing what could have been a monumental mistake, and as the truth became undeniable, the room buzzed quietly with murmurs of approval. Some of the senior executives even exchanged small smiles, realizing that hierarchy and experience, as valuable as they were, could still be outmatched by clarity and courage. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, his mind racing, not with frustration or anger, but with an uncharacteristic sense of gratitude. He recognized something rare in the maid, a combination of attention to detail, bravery, and presence of mind that he had seldom encountered. In that quiet, controlled office, surrounded by power and wealth, he understood that this ordinary young woman had done something extraordinary. The maid, standing quietly in the corner, tried to resume her work, but she could feel the weight of eyes on her. The attention was not critical or harsh, but full of respect and acknowledgement. She realized that she had crossed an invisible line, stepping from invisibility into recognition, and though she had not sought praise, she understood that what she had done mattered more than she had imagined. The executives slowly returned to their seats, muttering among themselves, recalculating their strategies for the now-delayed deal. The atmosphere had shifted subtly but profoundly. The room still held the air of authority and wealth, but now it also held a lesson. Insight and courage could come from anywhere, and sometimes the least expected voices could carry the greatest truths. The billionaire finally set down his pen and looked around the room, his expression unreadable at first, then softening. His eyes returned to the maid, and he said again, this time with a subtle smile, "You've saved us all today." The words were simple, but they carried immense weight, and in that moment, the maid realized that her voice, quiet and hesitant moments before, had made a real difference. The executives, inspired and humbled, began to take notes, not of the numbers or clauses, but of the lesson that had just unfolded before them. The incident reminded everyone that attention to detail, courage to speak, and honesty could sometimes outweigh titles, experience, and even wealth. The maid returned to her routine, quietly tidying the edges of the room, her heart still racing, but now filled with a quiet sense of pride. Outside, the city continued its endless rush, unaware that within one tall building, a single voice had frozen a billionaire mid-deal, prevented disaster, and reminded everyone that courage and clarity could come from the most unexpected source. In that moment, the ordinary and extraordinary had collided, leaving a mark on everyone present that would not be forgotten, a silent testament to the power of observation, insight, and bravery. The room was still buzzing quietly from the shock of what had just happened, but slowly, the atmosphere began to shift, from tension to acknowledgement, from disbelief to admiration. Everyone present realized that something extraordinary had just occurred. The ordinary young maid, who had entered the room unnoticed just moments ago, was now at the center of attention, not because of wealth or power, but because of courage, insight, and an unshakable sense of right. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the table, as he studied her quietly, a subtle smile forming on his face. He had seen countless deals, navigated countless crises, and yet, rarely had he encountered someone who could act with such clarity and bravery under pressure. He motioned for her to approach, and the maid, heart pounding, stepped forward, unsure what to expect, feeling both fear and anticipation in equal measure. Today, the billionaire began, his voice calm but commanding. "You did something no one else could have done." His eyes met hers, unwavering, and for the first time, the room felt as if it had shifted entirely. The executives, usually so commanding and confident, now looked on with awe, recognizing the extraordinary courage it took for someone so unassuming to speak up in a room filled with power. He continued, "Your observation saved millions, and prevented a deal that could have cost the company dearly." Every word he spoke seemed to echo in the room, reverberating through the air like a quiet drumbeat of recognition. The executives nodded silently, some exchanging knowing glances, realizing that this young maid had not only prevented disaster but had done so with grace and precision. The maid's cheeks flushed, and for a moment she looked down at her hands, unsure how to respond. She had not expected praise, recognition, or reward. She had simply acted because she knew it was the right thing to do. Yet here she was, standing in front of one of the most powerful men she had ever seen, acknowledged for her bravery and intellect. The billionaire motioned for one of the executives to approach, and soon a certificate of recognition was presented, along with a modest bonus and a promise of opportunities for further growth within the company. The gesture, while practical, carried a symbolic weight far greater than money. It was validation, proof that courage, honesty, and attention to detail could be recognized, respected, and rewarded, regardless of status. The executives began to murmur among themselves, some quietly praising her, others shaking their heads in amazement. The room had always been a world of hierarchy, where titles and experience dictated value. But today, the hierarchy had been challenged. A simple truth spoken at the right moment had changed the dynamic, proving that brilliance and insight were not limited to the corner office. Even the billionaire, known for his stoicism, allowed himself a rare smile, a glimmer of warmth in his usually sharp gaze. "Let this be a lesson," he said, "that anyone, no matter their role, can make a difference if they are brave enough to act and honest enough to speak." His words carried authority, but also a rare humility, acknowledging that even the most powerful could learn from the least expected. The maid returned to her duties after the acknowledgement, quietly resuming her work, but she could feel the change around her, a subtle shift in how the executives treated her, a respect that had been absent before. She realized that her courage had not only prevented a mistake but had also opened doors, showing that intelligence and bravery could not be ignored, even in a world defined by wealth and influence. Outside the boardroom, life continued as usual, yet inside, something had changed. The lesson of that day would linger in the minds of everyone present. That ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things, and that recognition sometimes came not to those who expected it, but to those who acted when it mattered most. The maid's quiet courage had become a story in itself, a reminder that true value is measured not by status, but by action, insight, and integrity. And in that quiet triumph, the ordinary became extraordinary, the overlooked became indispensable, and a single voice had reshaped the perception of power, leaving an imprint on everyone who witnessed it, a moment that would be remembered, retold, and admired for years to come. The meeting had ended, the contract safely revised, and the room slowly emptied, leaving behind the quiet hum of a boardroom still echoing with the weight of what had just occurred. The billionaire sat back in his chair, alone for a moment, and allowed himself to reflect, his mind replaying every detail, every word, every glance. He had navigated countless high-stakes deals, but rarely had a moment left such a lasting impression. He thought about the maid, the young woman whose presence he had barely noticed at the start, and yet whose single sentence had frozen him mid-deal. Her courage had cut through the polished layers of corporate formality, exposing truth in its simplest form. It was a reminder that brilliance did not always announce itself with titles, accolades, or wealth. Sometimes, it arrived quietly, unexpectedly, and demanded to be heard. Outside the boardroom, the maid returned to her ordinary duties, sweeping the floor, arranging chairs, carrying trays, yet something had shifted. She moved with a quiet confidence she had not known before, feeling the subtle weight of recognition on her shoulders, not as a burden, but as proof that her voice, when used wisely, could matter. That day, she had learned that courage was not loud or boastful, it was precise, purposeful, and timely. The executives who had witnessed the moment carried it with them long after the meeting ended. Their perception of power and authority had shifted. They understood now that insight and truth could come from the least expected, and that listening, even to the quietest voice, could prevent disaster and create opportunity. In offices across the building, the story of the maid's intervention began to circulate quietly, inspiring conversations about attention, courage, and humility. The billionaire, a man usually reserved and calculating, reflected on the lesson he had learned. He realized that no matter how successful one became, no matter how sharp or experienced, there was always a limit to what he could see alone. He had relied on his team. Yet it was someone outside the hierarchy, someone invisible by conventional standards, who had reminded him of the value of observation, honesty, and bravery. The maid, though unaccustomed to recognition, began to understand the true power of action. She had stepped forward not for reward, but because she saw a mistake that could have had serious consequences. Her courage had shifted the course of events, saved the company, and left a lasting impression on people who wielded far more power than she had ever imagined. It was proof that integrity and bravery were universal, transcending position, class, or expectation. Days later, the billionaire reflected again, quietly in his office, thinking about the decisions that truly shaped a company and a life. He considered the lesson the maid had unknowingly taught him. That leadership was not just about authority, wealth, or knowledge, but about openness, humility, and the courage to listen, even when the insight came from an unexpected source. He understood that the greatest victories often arose from collaboration and awareness, not ego or domination. The maid, now quietly respected and acknowledged, continued her work with the same diligence as before, but she carried a new awareness within her, a confidence that she had never possessed. She realized that ordinary people could make extraordinary differences, that the smallest voice could carry the heaviest truth, and that courage, even in its simplest form, could create ripples far beyond the moment of action. In that convergence of ordinary and extraordinary, of silence and speech, the story left an enduring lesson, one that would resonate far beyond the boardroom, beyond the walls of power and money, beyond the titles and hierarchy. The story became a reminder that truth, courage, and insight are not measured by status, but by the willingness to act when it matters most, that one person, one observation, one voice, could truly change everything. And as the day ended, the city outside carried on, unaware of the quiet hero who had reshaped the course of a billion-dollar deal. But inside the building, and in the hearts and minds of all who witnessed it, the impact was profound, unforgettable, a testament to the enduring power of courage, wisdom, and the belief that even the smallest voice deserves to be heard.